Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to be interrupted. I have a wife and 2 kids. It makes me more comfortable to be interrupted, so just shout out questions. Otherwise, I'm going to go through kind of just some basic backcountry decision stuff to follow up on the panel we just had. And as we noted before, so if you look at kind of avalanche fatalities by county, you can see Pitkin County leads the state for the reasons we just talked about in the panel, with the other bullseye being that kind of Summit County, Clear Creek. And this is all about easy access to really steep avalanche terrain, which we have ample access to here, largely because of a very generous open boundary policy from SCICO. So when we're talking about an avalanche, to just demystify the whole thing, it's any kind of snow just moving down the hill. That's it. And we see avalanches take place on like Discovery Channel and TGR films, all that stuff, and they're big, dramatic, giant powder clouds, trees getting thrown. Most of the stuff that kills people aren't like that. They're like this. They're small avalanches in bad spots. This was an avalanche that took place on Monarch Pass some years ago. Guy left the ski area and ended up getting buried on the highway. Not a big avalanche, nothing that's going to make a TGR movie, but it's this kind of stuff, which is what gets most people into trouble. There was a CDOT worker driving on Highway 50 over Monarch Pass that just happened to come across this thing as it happened and dug this guy out before he perished. So unfortunately, he made it through this. And so when we talk about avalanches, we break them out into these categories. And it's important because we're not just trying to shove Mother Nature into boxes, but this has implications for how we manage ourselves and our risk in the backcountry. And so they break along loose snow avalanches versus slab, so cohesionless snow, which can be wet or dry, so sloughing versus wet avalanche activity in the spring, or slabs, the cohesive plates of snow that will break out of the surrounding snowpack. And then what we've done is shoved Mother Nature into more boxes. And so this is important. Mother Nature doesn't like to fit in boxes in general, but this is an important effort for us in terms of public safety communication. And the reason these avalanche problem types came around is because for years, people that were traveling in the backcountry, working in the avalanche industry, realized we approach the backcountry differently depending on the type of avalanche we expect to encounter in the field, right? And the reason is they have different likelihoods and different consequences, but they have, most importantly, different risk management strategies in the field. And I'll bin these into slightly different stuff, but this is a critical piece of the avalanche forecast. It's not just the danger rating. So I want to know how the danger rating will tell you the likelihood of you getting into trouble or encountering an avalanche. The avalanche problem type and where it lies in the terrain will give you really important information for how you need to manage yourself and your group in the backcountry. And so when we look at the loose snow avalanches, this is easy. They break down into just 2 branches. They're either wet or dry. They can and do get people into trouble, and people die from these things all the time. However, they are much more predictable. We expect loose, dry avalanches immediately during storms, after big storms. If we've had long dry spells, we can have sloughing in just the facets on the surface that are big enough to start pushing people around. But we know these are coming. They've catch very few people by surprise in general because, like for example, loose wet avalanches, we know we need to introduce some liquid water. The snowpack needs to lose some cohesion, and we expect loose wet avalanches. So it's not that you can't get into trouble with loose avalanches, it's just that they're much more predictable, therefore easier to manage. When we talk about slab avalanches, we break them down into these different categories. And I've binned wind slab and storm slab. And the reason is that these are transient problems. They develop pretty quickly, and then they live on the order of days, not weeks or months. The weak layer involved in storm snow instabilities, and wind and storm slabs are both storm snow instabilities, is that they're breaking on non-persistent weak layers, which are generally just broken apart snowflakes that fall from the air. So they are weak layers, and they're quite dangerous when they're there, but they go away really quickly on the order of days. The other thing is when these avalanches fail, they fail in fairly easy to predict ways, and I'll show a few images of that. We've got persistent instabilities, and as the name implies, they stick around for a long time. Once we have persistent slab avalanches develop in our snowpack, not only are they persistent and stick around for a while, but their behavior is very hard to predict. How the avalanches are going to break across the terrain and where you're going to trigger them from is very unpredictable. This requires a totally different approach in the backcountry for risk management. And unfortunately for us here in Colorado, given the nature of our snowpack, you will see persistent slab avalanche problem in the forecast many, many days throughout the winter. But given the unpredictability of how these avalanches are going to fail, they just require a much wider buffer when moving into and around avalanche terrain. And then wet slabs, when we start to see these kind of rear their head, usually in the spring, when we start to introduce liquid water deep enough to impact buried weak layers for the first time, we'll see an uptick in wet slab avalanche activity. These are very, very hard to forecast. So all we know as avalanche forecasters is we have conditions that might lead to wet slab avalanche activity, right? And so sometimes we will list this as an avalanche problem and you'll never see wet slabs occur. But when you see us listing it as an avalanche problem, all we know is that the conditions are there for wet slab avalanches. And the best way, essentially, to manage your risk from this is to just exit the field early in the day before we introduce too much water. So wind slab avalanches like this are very aspect dependent because they require the wind to drift the snow, break apart the pieces, the branches of the snowflakes into smaller little pieces. They compress them into cohesive, stiff layers of snow on the leeward sides of slopes. So not only are they aspect dependent, so we know where to look for them on like which aspects in the slopes, but when they fail in fairly easy to predict ways. In other words, they will stay confined to what we traditionally would consider the start zone of an avalanche. So on these storm slab and wind slab avalanches, these storm instabilities, you tend to have to be right on top of them to trigger them. So they tend to break at your feet generally. You're not doing this from many yards or away. And when they fail in a way that you would think they would. Like, oh, this is the start zone of the avalanche, and sure enough, that's where they break. And that's what these photos illustrate. So you can see, the images are showing several wind events where the cohesive pieces of slabs have built up on the leeward slope. But again, they're breaking right at this guy's feet, and you can see that they stay confined to what we could traditionally consider the start zone. So again, wind slab avalanche, and again, you can see how the terrain confines where this is going to go. So not only is where you're going to trigger storm instabilities more predictable, but how the avalanches are going to fail are more predictable. All make sense? Here's another perfect example. So you expect them on the leeward sides, the wind-loaded slopes right below ridgeline, and again, you can see how they fail. Here's just an example. Whoops, I guess I don't. Arturo, are you able to play that by clicking on it? Okay. It's just showing that this guy triggers it on his first turn. So you can see the cornice here is giving you some indication that this slope has been loaded. You'll have wind-loaded slopes right below the cornices. So you'd expect if you're going to find a wind slab, it's going to be right in here. He takes a turn, it triggers, and it's confined to this little piece of terrain. It doesn't branch out and do funky stuff. Storm slabs are very similar in behavior to wind slab avalanches, but by definition, they're not really aspect dependent. So in this case, the storm snow is falling, and you're getting the slab to stiffen not through wind drifting of snow, but through the snow settling under the influence of gravity. And if you leave storm snow out there for enough time, it will settle just through the influence of gravity into a stiff enough layer that it can release as a slab. So when you see storm slab avalanches, by definition, they're more ubiquitous in the terrain, which means they're going to cover a wide range of aspects and elevations. That makes sense? Where wind slab avalanches are much more aspect and elevation dependent. That was just a wet slab, but I'm going to not show that video because it's full of profanities. So persistent slab avalanches, by contrast, are very hard to predict. So in the images I'm showing you here, this avalanche, this persistent slab avalanche, was triggered from where the photo is taken. So from flat ground from hundreds of yards away. You do not see this behavior with storm snow, right? You need persistent weak layers in the snowpack. So when you start to see persistent slab avalanches in the avalanche forecast, it's a giant trigger to be like, oh my God, okay, I need to give myself much wider buffers. Because not only do I not know where I'm going to trigger these from, but I have these weak layers which are really trying to support very, very strong layers of snow. And they don't take much to fail. This guy is on the brink of failing, and our weak layers in the snowpack are like this all the time. So this is what this looks like in the snowpack. We've got strong layers of snow sitting above precarious weak layers like that guy trying to prop up that very strong cheerleader. And when they fail in very hard to predict ways. This is an avalanche that took place. This is right near Crested Butte. This group triggered this avalanche from there. So they're on this flat bench. It broke all the way up, and you can see how the crown is not confined to start zones. It has crossed into multiple start zones and around, and after these guys cleaned out their shorts, made it back safely. But you can't predict where you're going to trigger these persistent slab avalanches from, and when they break in crazy ways that will cross ridge lines. They will break around the corner. They will break through dense timber. You can trigger them from the flats and sometimes from 1,000 yards or more away, right? Let's see, are you able to play that one now? So this is near Beaver Creek, and this is just from a few seasons ago, but these people triggered this avalanche while approaching this slope, right? You only see this behavior with persistent instabilities. Am I driving that home enough? Here's one from the San Juans. Some snowmobilers came up, just encircling down here, pulled out this small pocket, but notably look at where this avalanche released. And these are the kinds of avalanche that catch it really experienced backcountry travelers off guard. So they may have decided, well, it's dangerous conditions, there's a persistent slab avalanche, I'm gonna stop lower down on the slope, I'm gonna transition here and not go into the start zone. They trigger things from below that come down and catch them. So when we talk about avalanche risk, it's really broken down into these components. You've got the likelihood that you're gonna trigger an avalanche, you've got the consequences or the destructive side of the avalanche, you've got your vulnerability. How many people are exposed and how likely am I to get hurt or worse in the avalanche? And then my exposure. Where am I in the terrain and how long am I in potentially dangerous spots? So these components break down into a very classic probability and consequence model, okay? And when we start to relate this to the avalanche forecast, the avalanche danger that you'll find in the forecast is wrapping up these two things. Like we talked about in the panel, avalanche danger is just something that exists. It is just an environmental condition. So it's us to humans on the other side of this equation to handle our personal risk management. This is where we can influence stuff. This is just what is, and we will give you this kind of information in the avalanche forecast, but this is what we can do. And so what we can do to limit our risk in the backcountry is use the terrain, right? This is the one kind of stagnant thing of this whole avalanche puzzle. Snowpack conditions are changing constantly. Weather is changing constantly. But the terrain in our non-geologic time frame is stagnant. And so we can use the terrain and build in buffers through our tour plans to match the avalanche problems that we've got. That's the one leg of this whole puzzle that we can control. And when I was first getting into mountain guiding, I remember we had clients, and I had a mentor, a Swiss guide from Crested Butte, and we were going out, we had ski clients, and it was high danger, and I was like, can we take clients out in high danger? And he's like, it's never high danger where I ski. Which took me a while to actually understand what the hell he was talking about, but all he was talking about was where I choose to go doesn't have the high danger. So you can always find safe terrain. And in high danger and things like that, you can just simply avoid avalanche terrain and make sure you have no overhead hazard. So what does avalanche terrain look like, and how do I choose more conservative terrain? So the bullseye for avalanches are in the 30 to 45 degree zone. When you get slopes much steeper than that, it's hard for us to accumulate enough snow without constant sloughing to actually build slabs up and be dangerous. If you are in very consequential terrain, you know, stuff like the east face of Pyramid, where even a really small size 1 slough can knock you off your feet and over a cliff, yes, really small avalanches can kill you in steep terrain. Below 30 degrees, it's very hard for us to trigger an avalanche that can overcome friction with the bed surface. So we'll get slabs to fail all the time on low angle terrain. That's that whoomph or that collapsing sound many of you have felt. But if it's not steep enough, it'll just collapse, and then there's too much friction with the bed surface, it won't slide anywhere. You might see some cracks, and you can see where the slab's broken loose. Just didn't have enough to overcome the friction with the bed surface. And so this is how we used to do it. We used to break out paper maps and topo maps, and we could ascertain slope angle through these kinds of metrics. Very few people are using paper maps anymore, although phones do die. So I want you all to consider what happens when your blue dot disappears because your phone's too cold. And make sure you know how to get yourself in and out of terrain safely. And paper maps still work. Most of us use stuff like this now, where we can plot tracks, we can use slope angle shading. This is just an example from CalTopo. These mobile apps are great. It has made it easier to interpret maps. It certainly made it easier to navigate. You can tell your phone to tell you where you are right now. It'll tell you what direction to go. Again, I would caution people to rely entirely on a phone for a few reasons. One, phones do die, and two, there are errors in these slope angle shading. And like I said, you know, at the beginning when we showed that guy who got buried on Monarch Pass, small slopes like that often will not show up in slope angle shading because the resolution is not good enough. And we've got slope errors. And we've seen this new generation of backcountry travelers, in some cases, go out there with their phone and their blue dot and try to connect pixels with yellow colors. This is not a safe approach to the backcountry. Right? You cannot go out there and try to connect pixels on a computer screen to keep yourself safe. You must be aware of your surroundings and the slope angles around you, including small slopes. Small slopes and bad spots get people into trouble all the time. So we have vegetative clues that we are in avalanche terrain, like big swaths of trees missing. And so avalanche danger will change with aspect, both to the sun. In general, around here, depending on the time of the year, we will see persistent instabilities heal much quicker on southerly aspects that get more sun than you will see on cold northerly aspects, for example. That game will often flip in the spring, where we will see southerly aspects start to lose cohesion in the spring because they're getting more sun, where northerly slopes will stay intact and safer later in the day. So avalanche danger changes a lot from aspect to sun, from aspect to wind, for the reason we talked about. We will pick up snow from windward sides and create slabs and potentially wind slab avalanche problems on leeward slides. Sometimes we get very clear indications which direction the wind's blowing, like this one up on Monarch. And sometimes it's really subtle, but we can pick these kinds of clues up in the terrain. I can see that these knobs on either side of this gully have been scoured clean of snow. So I know moving around, the snow's been blowing from left to right in this case, and here you can see we've got a small wind slab pocket. Doesn't seem very big, and it's not, and it doesn't seem particularly dangerous, but we see this in this valley every November and October. As people go out, they're jonesing to get on their skis, the snowpack, the coverage is very shallow, they get caught in small avalanches because it's hard to trigger a big avalanche in early November. There's not that much snow on the ground. But imagine taking a ride in that. That is awful. Right? You're just getting dragged through rocks. And so small avalanches, particularly early season where you've got shallowly buried obstacles or barely covered rocks, are particularly dangerous. And we see that here all the time. Every November, someone has a close call or worse in this valley, usually up in Montezuma or somewhere nearby, because it's how we can get up high from here. So people will go find the earliest snow they can get, and then they all get raked through the rocks. So we will show you in the avalanche forecast, this is the avalanche problem distribution rows right here. And so this is you looking down on the terrain from above, bird's eye view, but we will show you where the most problematic aspects are. So what we show you with our avalanche distribution rows is where you're most likely to encounter avalanches. Okay? It doesn't mean avalanches are impossible in the white zones, so please don't approach it that way. We're telling you where the most problematic slopes are, where you're most likely to get into trouble. It doesn't mean you can shut your brain off on westerly aspects in this case, right? Get the big picture. These are the types of avalanches you're going to encounter in the field. We usually have really high confidence in the kind of avalanche you're going to find. And then we have a little bit less confidence on which aspects exactly are going to harbor those. And so what we will show you are going to be what are the most dangerous. So you can build a trip plan accordingly. Avalanche danger will change with elevation, and similarly that information is communicated in the avalanche problem distribution rows. And then you can really keep yourself out of trouble if you can identify and avoid terrain traps. So terrain traps are just terrain features that make the consequences of getting caught in any size slide worse. And so if you can avoid traveling above gullies, which will pile up snow very quickly, or very sharp transitions in slope angle. So that guy on Monarch Pass triggered an avalanche on a short but steep slope onto a highway, which is dead flat. We have road cuts out here all the time. Road cuts will pile up snow very deeply, very quickly. Getting washed into trees is a really is one of the most common ways that people suffer trauma. You get caught in avalanches, you get raked into trees, people die or get severely injured from being beaten up by getting washed into it. Small avalanches that knock you off cliffs or rock faces are of course very bad, and lakes are about as bad as it gets. So we have had a number of avalanches in Colorado where people are above frozen lakes, they get caught in an avalanche, washed, ice breaks, your chances of coming out of that are almost zero. So the locations in the terrain that can increase the consequences of being caught in an avalanche are just to be avoided. So it's important for your personal risk management when you're out there traveling around in the backcountry to, before you commit to moving into any steep slope of any size, consider the consequences of like what's going to happen to me if I get swept off my feet here, right? Where sometimes even a very small avalanche can be quite dangerous. So here's an example of snow piling up very deeply with just a really quick transition from steep to flat. And you can see that's a lot of snow, which has not gone very far. That can bury someone quite deeply. Your chances of survival go down dramatically with burial depth because it just takes longer to get to you. Road cuts, like we just talked about. This was not so dangerous in a snowcat. The guy was probably a little bit scared, but if you're moving around on a snowmobile or on snowshoes or on your skis, this is enough to bury you. Gullies, crevasses, which you don't have to worry about much here, but certainly in glaciated terrain, getting washed into a crevasse is about as bad as getting washed into a lake. And then open creeks. And this was the case of, if you remember the snowshoers that were going into their cabin a few years back in Marble, they were just snowshoeing into Ewell Creek, triggered an avalanche, washed into the creek bed. And then trees. So it's relentlessly think about the terrain you're moving through and considering the consequences of even small avalanches in the wrong spot being very, very dangerous. And then I'm gonna skip through these. I meant to hide these. This is what we do. We're tracking conditions, so this is what you'll get from us out of the avalanche forecast. We're constantly digging and looking. We're identifying problematic weak layers. We're seeing how they change over time and communicating that information to you via the avalanche forecast. This is just what we looks like in the field on the right, and then we plot this stuff up and communicate it to the public and our colleagues on the left. Okay, so avalanche conditions change with location, aspect, slope angle, and elevation. And it's important to note that we communicate part of this through the North American Avalanche Public Danger Scale, which is 5-tiered, and that most avalanches occur in moderate and considerable danger. So this is something we fight against all the time here, particularly message fatigue. We will often be in moderate danger for long periods of time or many, many days throughout the winter. That does not mean it's safe. We don't see a lot of avalanche fatalities and low danger simply because it's generally safe avalanche conditions. We don't see a lot of avalanche dangers and high or extreme danger because it's so dangerous, people are completely avoiding avalanche terrain. It's in this moderate to considerable zone where some slopes are reasonable some of the time. That makes for much trickier decision-making and trip planning. But I really want to point out that moderate is not the new green. Like, it is not safe. And just because it sits near the bottom of a 5-tier scale does not mean this is safe, right? It means the likelihood of triggering avalanches is often lower, so it's not blaring dangerous at you, but the consequences have not changed. It means we don't expect a lot of natural avalanche activity, but human-triggered avalanches remain a threat. And then this is the information that you will get out of an avalanche forecast, and you can use these things to develop trip plans suitable for the condition in your group to stay safe in the backcountry. I think that's all I got. Yeah. Yeah, my pleasure. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much to Brian, and I want to thank him publicly for everything he's done over the last 6 to 10 weeks to support the production of today's event. Coming up next at 4 o'clock, so right around the corner, you can stay in your seats or grab a drink or run an errand before you settle in, but we're here to culminate today's symposium with our keynote from Lou Dawson in conversation with Chris Davenport. And I also want to remind you that right at 4 o'clock, we are going to pull over 20 winners of amazing items, gears, and prizes that have been contributed to this inaugural Backcountry Symposium giveaway raffle. So we'll see you back here in just a few minutes. Let us just get the stage ready for 4 o'clock. Thank you.